We now will go through the rounds of questioning of 5 minutes by each senator. Mr. Haas, I understood bankruptcy in a basic form to say you're a company and you have more debts than you have assets. And you go into court and say, I want to be discharged from this debt, prepared to pay whatever I can, and I want a fresh start. So I take a look at Johnson & Johnson and say, does that fit in this situation that they would go to bankruptcy court? In October 2021, when LTL first filed bankruptcy, Johnson & Johnson had a market capitalization of approximately $420 billion. 2022, year following LTL's bankruptcy filing, Johnson & Johnson generated $94.9 billion in sales and $63.9 billion in profit. September 2022, Johnson & Johnson announced a $5 billion stock buyback. Johnson & Johnson paid a dividend in every quarter since LTL declared bankruptcy, returning even more money to shareholders. You've dismissed the claims against you for a possible asbestos in your product, calling them meritless, junk science, one-off and beyond that. And yet you put a valuation through LTL of $8.9 billion in these claims. How can you have it both ways? How can you be a profitable corporation worth that much money and say these meritless claims were worth $8.9 billion and you shouldn't be responsible for them? Turn the microphone on, please. Microphone. Thank you.
The entity that sold and manufactured the talc was Johnson & Johnson's Consumer Inc., and it was in a loss position in 2020, the year before the LTL entity went into bankruptcy. So JJCI could have gone itself into bankruptcy. This is not a story about J&J. It's a story about JJCI, Johnson & Johnson's Consumer Inc. In the transaction that we undertook in order to create LTL and to place LTL in bankruptcy, we actually provided the claimants, the talc claimants, with more recourse, more assets than they would have had we not done the transaction if JJCI as the enterprise had gone into bankruptcy alone. So what we were able to accomplish is two things, which were, as the Third Circuit recognized, the objective of the bankruptcy code. One is to optimize the recourse available to claimants, and the second is to make sure that viable enterprises can go forward to the extent possible.
There's something missing here. Why would you create LTL, which made no products whatsoever, but simply was there as the repository of some funds for any liability, if in fact the underlying company that made this product in question, the company was worth so few assets at the time? It doesn't follow. Let me ask you another question. I think I read somewhere that your company, Johnson & Johnson, has changed the formulation of their baby powder over the years. Is that true?
Johnson & Johnson Consumer Inc., the subsidiary, changed the formulation to take talc out and use cornstarch instead. And they did that in 2020 because the demand for talc had gone down because of the advertising by
potential liability in a tort suit?
Excuse me?
It had nothing to do with your potential liability in a tort suit?
No, to the contrary. As we stated at the time, it had to do with the demand that had decreased due to false and misleading advertising by the plaintiff's bar. And that is at core what is the issue here. These claims are meritless, but nonetheless, even though they're
meritless, but worth $8.9 billion.
The $8.9 billion was an amount that we did not come up with. It is a number that the claimants came up with. The counsel for the vast majority of claimants approached us with an offer. And they approached us and they said, if you are willing to pay $8.9 billion, we will take that. We claimants will take it. And that's why we went back into bankruptcy, because we did so with written agreements from counsel for the vast majority of claimants.
Vast majority of claimants, which of course means that others who wanted their day in court for establishing their own recovery wouldn't have that chance.
In bankruptcy, in order for a plan to be confirmed, you need, for this particular type of plan, you need a supermajority of plaintiffs, not just a vast majority, but a supermajority. And that plan needs to be confirmed by the bankruptcy court. So that plan would have been approved only into the extent that the supermajority of claimants and the court determined it was the right thing to do. Our intent going into bankruptcy was to simply let the claimants and the court decide whether or not this was the appropriate resolution. Because again, this was a plan that came to us, that was proposed to us as a resolution that was in the best interest of claimants. And the reason for that is twofold. One, we were winning the majority of cases in the tort system. So most claimants get nothing, absolutely nothing for litigating tort system. Secondly,
You make two arguments here. Meritless. Claimants get nothing. They will recover nothing. And yet somebody comes up with a figure of $8.9 billion and you jump at it.
right, and that is
You have it both ways. You just can't argue both ways. You went into bankruptcy court to limit the liability of Johnson & Johnson, CI or Johnson & Johnson. And luckily, at least at one or two different levels, the courts have said, this is a sham. This is a maneuver in the court which is not anticipated by the bankruptcy code. Senator Graham.